If you clicked on this video, it's likely you've had problems getting your broadheads to fly with your field points at some point, and I know just how frustrating it can be. I remember when I was younger, I used to write on my fletchings of each arrow to mark which way the arrow would go when I needed to take a shot, as some would hit high left and some would hit low right, and everywhere in between. Despite the adjustments I made or how I indexed my broadheads, I could never get them all to fly just like my field points. It lowered my confidence as a bow hunter, and I knew I had to figure out how to fix this. Technology and bows have improved a lot since then, but these problems can still persist. That thing is flying so crooked. Truth be told, there's a lot more to getting your broadheads to fly with your field points than simply moving your rest one direction or another. There are many different factors that can affect this, but I'm not trying to confuse you or overload you with information. I just want to put all of the factors out there and show you what to do to fix it so that you can be as accurate as possible and the best bow hunter that you strive to be, especially if you've struggled with this issue in the past, even if you've watched other videos on it. The very first thing we need to do is synchronize our cams. Now, if you are shooting any bow other than a single cam bow, it is very, very important that you get the synchronization of your cams perfect. If the sync is off even just a little bit, even as much of just 1/8 of an inch, it will absolutely affect your vertical nock travel, and the arrow will either come out nock high or nock low, and no amount of nocking point adjustment or rest adjustment will be able to correct it for the arrow flight all the way down range. If your arrow is not coming out of your bow straight, not only will your broadheads not fly accurately and consistently, but you will also suffer a lack of penetration because the arrow is not carrying that full energy in a straight line all the way through your target. In order to set your cam sync, you're going to need a bow press for this. If you do not have a bow press, go to your local archery shop, let them help you. Your cams must be in sync. There is no easy way around this. They have to be perfect, or anything else you do when you're trying to broadhead tune will not matter. Next, I want to talk about your arrow choice. Your arrow spine, your fletchings, and your broadhead choice are all going to have an impact on how your arrow flies, regardless of how well your bow is tuned. So I just want to touch on a few things here just to give you some insight to how your broadheads will fly given your arrow setup. First off, arrow spine is important when it comes to broadhead tuning. Static arrow spine refers to how stiff or how weak the shaft is. If your arrows are too stiff, it's generally not a problem for compound archers using a mechanical release head. However, if your arrows are too weak, the arrow flexes too much, which can result in sporadic arrow flight with broadheads and just inconsistencies in general, regardless of how well the bow itself is tuned. Generally speaking, when shooting broadheads, a weak arrow will impact to the right of your field points for a right-handed archer, but moving your rest won't necessarily fix it. The easiest way to determine this is to look at the arrow charts that your arrow manufacturer puts out there on the back of the arrow boxes. Simply align the column with your cut arrow length and your poundage range, and it will give you the spine that you should be shooting. In all reality, this is just a starting point, but it will almost always work good enough for just broadhead tuning, as it won't give you an arrow shaft spine that is too weak. Keep in mind your total point weight, your insert weight, and how aggressive or how hard your cams are all going to have an impact on the dynamic spine or the reaction of the arrow spine when you're shooting your arrow shaft. Now, most charts will compensate for this with certain adjustments that you need to make, such as ESIN. I believe if you have an additional 25 grains in the front, they say to raise your poundage on the chart by 3 pounds per 25 grains. But this also has to come into play with how fast your bow is shooting your arrow, because that is directly proportionate to how hard it's pushing the back of the shaft, and that will affect how much that arrow is flexing when it is coming out of the bow. To give you an example of Rachel's setup, she is shooting approximately 45 pounds with a 27-inch arrow. And so if you look at the chart, she's right in that 500 range, but could potentially be shooting a 400 spine arrow as well. Now, obviously, the 400 spine arrow would be stiffer than the 500 spine arrow, which would be weaker and flex more. But given her settings, looking at the charts, the 500 spine arrow, although weaker than the 400, will be plenty adequate for her to use. So if we look at my arrow setup with this bow, my arrow is 27.5 inches and I'm shooting about 80 pounds. I've got 50 grains of brass in the insert and I shoot a 100 grain point. So if I look at the chart, the Easton arrow chart, it's going to tell me I need to add 6 pounds of draw weight for that additional 50 grains that I've got in the front of my arrow, and that will lead me to the range of a 300 spine to a 260 spine on the chart. So I choose to shoot an Easton Axis 300 spine and it works perfectly fine for me with this setup, but you could of course go to that 260 spine, which would be a little bit stiffer, and it would work just fine and be just a slightly heavier arrow for you. Now these charts don't get your arrow spine perfect by any means, but it will get you close enough so that your broadheads can be flying with your field points. I also want to mention that it's very important that the ends of your arrows are cut square so that the nock and the broadhead fit flush on the ends of your shaft. If the nock is bent or the broadhead has any kind of wobble, it can be extremely difficult to shoot accurately with that arrow, especially when it comes to shooting at distance. So I do recommend checking your arrows on an arrow spinner to make sure that your nock and your broadhead do not have a wobble to them. One last short comment about arrows. I have personally found that indexing your vanes with your broadheads and spine alignment in the shaft is not as important as it may be perceived. So you really don't need to worry about wasting your time on those specific steps. Not that you can't do them, you can absolutely do them, and if that builds confidence, that is great. But I've found it is not a necessary requirement to get my broadheads to fly extremely accurate with my field points. Next, let's talk about fletchings and broadheads. There are no hard and fast rules on this, but I just want to explain it in a way that is easy for everyone to understand. Your fletchings serve as wings on the back of your arrow. These wings catch air and catch drag and steer your arrow in a straight line towards your target. It's important to understand it is not the length of the fletching that gives you the steering power from the back of your arrow. It's actually the height or the distance that that fletching extends away from the shaft that provides the steering power. This is why a standard 2-inch blazer vane can actually have more steering power for your broadheads than a 3-inch vane that has a lower profile or lower height away from the arrow shaft. Fletching helical can also play a big role in this as it increases the surface area that the air is catching, which will essentially increase its steering power. It makes sense that we would want as much steering power as possible to steer our broadheads to provide us the most accuracy downrange, but there are some drawbacks to having too much steering power on your arrows. It's important to find the right mix. If our fletchings are too tall and stick out too far away from the center of our arrow, this increases our likelihood to get fletching contact on the rest, the cables, the cable guard, the bow, anything like that, which can give us issues with arrow flight no matter how well your bow is tuned otherwise. Additionally, the more steering power we have on our arrows, the more drag is induced on those arrows in flight, especially as we get out in distance. Now, when there's a lot more drag on your arrows due to the fletchings, this also creates noise in flight. When your arrows and fletchings have a combination that provides a lot of steering power, you will notice a big difference in arrow noise, and it's not always the bow noise that spooks animals and makes them duck. It's the arrow noise when that arrow is coming towards them. It's important to find a good fletching and good fletching combination for your setup so that you can achieve the optimal amount of steering where you've got enough but aren't lacking with not enough to steer your broadheads. To keep this simple, just make sure that your fletching combination has more steering power than your broadhead. To quantify this in simple sense, if you're shooting a big fixed blade broadhead, I'm talking really big. Think a 4-fletch combination with some kind of helical with a fletching height of at least a 1/2 inch. Now, if you're going to be shooting a low profile fixed blade or especially a low profile mechanical like a G5 dead meat or a Rage, less steering power could be required. So you could get away with simply running a 3-fletch on a boning heat vane, for example, with little to no helical if you chose to. I always like to err on the side of more steering than less. But it's important that you do find that right combination for you. There's a lot more factors that go into this, such as arrow speed, arrow weight, momentum, etc., but don't get too caught up in this. As long as your fletchings have enough steering power to steer your broadheads, it will not be the cause of your inaccuracy downrange. Now again, I always like to stay on the side of having too much steering rather than not enough, to avoid any inconsistency issues all around. But don't overthink this. With all that said, I see way too commonly arrows with extreme helicals on their fletchings, and it's just simply put, not needed. A slight offset or slight helical is really all you need to get that proper steering with the proper fletching. If you've made it to this point so far, you're on the right track. The next portion I want to mention can actually save you time and be more beneficial if you put this time in to tuning your bow before you even shoot broadheads, and that is paper tuning and bare shaft tuning. Many may argue that one or the other is a waste of time and it doesn't matter for the end result, but sometimes bare shaft tuning or paper tuning can show you the differences and the results that just shooting broadheads might not. It is indeed possible to get your broadheads to fly with your field points and still not have your broadhead arrow flying straight out of your bow. Sometimes paper tuning or bare shaft tuning can show you results that you might need to adjust cam spacers or shift your cams when the broadheads might not. And simply just adjusting your rest can be very frustrating when you're making those adjustments and you're not seeing the results that you want. An example would be shooting through paper at 3 feet and getting a right tear, but then backing up to 10 feet and shooting your arrow through paper and getting a left tear. And what is happening is when you shoot that arrow initially, it is kicked tail right coming out of the bow, but by the time you get back to 10 feet, those fletchings have corrected and that arrow has fishtailed to the left-hand side. Now, from this, we know that we will make the adjustment to the first tear, the tear at 3 feet, so that that arrow is not kicking out to the right first. But if we're shooting broadheads, we're simply going to adjust based on the broadhead flight, and that could be misleading. Whereas with the paper tuning, we can see exactly what is going on because that arrow is fishtailing back and forth at those different distances. Now, if we only adjust our rest horizontally, we may not be getting the results that we're looking for. So how do we determine if we need to adjust our cams, shimmer cams left or right horizontally, or adjust our rest left or right horizontally? Well, ideally, in a perfect world, we want to have a rest set up with our arrow at center shot for the manufacturer of the bow that you're shooting and adjust the spacers based off of that. Now, of course, we can adjust the rest so that it is off center shot. I always like to say we tune the bow to how it shoots, not how it looks or how it measures. So if it is slightly off of the perfect measurement of center shot, that is completely okay as long as the arrow is flying straight. This is just a general rule of thumb that I like to go off of. I like to keep it centered on the center shot and adjust the cam spacers to adapt to it accordingly. Now, the compound bow is a machine, but you as the shooter are a part of that machine because you directly input how that machine functions when you shoot it. So all of that to say, it is important when you're doing the fine tuning of your setup, regardless if it is paper tuning, bare shaft tuning, or the final adjustments with broadhead tuning, it's important that you as the archer are the one shooting it so that you can tune it to how you shoot. I'm not going to go more in depth on this here as we have several other videos on this specifically within our bow builds and our Ultimate Bow Build Masterclass, but ultimately, if you've got clean tears through paper at multiple distances and your bare shafts are impacting with your field point arrows at 20 yards, your broadhead tuning should require very minimal adjustments to get them flying accurately with your field points. Now that we have confirmed our cams are in sync, we have the proper arrow spine selection and fletching combinations, we have done our preliminary tuning with our paper tuning and bare shaft tuning, we are finally ready to shoot our broadheads downrange. Now, you can keep this simple. I just recommend going to 20 yards. Make sure your sight is sighted in with your field points right on. And what we're going to do is shoot our field points into the target and shoot our broadheads and look for the variances to make adjustments. Now at this point, if you have followed all of these steps, your arrow spine is correct, you have enough steering power with your fletchings, and you're not getting fletching contact, your broadhead tipped arrows should at least group together in the same general direction. If they're not and they're impacting multiple different directions around your field points, it is likely that it is some kind of form or shooting issue, typically within the grip, or sometimes extreme cases of extra facial pressure that is just not needed. If this is the case, I highly recommend to please go back and watch some of our Learn Archery videos on our Learn Archery playlist. I recommend watching the draw length video, the bow grip video, and the anchor point videos for whatever it is of the style of release that you are using. This was my problem many years ago when I first started shooting, so believe me when I say you're not alone on this. Everybody typically goes through this at some point, but it is very important that you learn. It's important that you fine-tune yourself before you go to work fine-tuning your equipment, because if you have inconsistencies with your shot, it can be very, very, very difficult to tune in general, let alone get your broadheads to fly consistently with your field points. Now let's discuss what adjustments we need to make based off of where the broadheads are flying relative to our field points. The goal of this is to get the string pushing the back of the arrow straight forward in a straight line, so that arrow is guided straight forward to the target with no inconsistencies or variables that will make that broadhead fly off from your field points. If the broadheads are flying consistently off in one direction, this is a good thing because we can adjust it and fix it, but what is happening is the back of the arrow is being pushed out of the bow at an angle that does not align with the front of the arrow shaft. If the back of your arrow is kicked up, down, left, or right, a broadhead tipped arrow is basically going to steer that shaft in whatever direction it is that that arrow is angled towards. And this is because the broadheads with the blades on the front of the shaft almost act as fletchings, similar to the fletchings on the back of your shaft, and they will steer your arrow that direction. Whereas with a field point, the field point does not have those steering capabilities that a broadhead does, and so the fletchings on the back of the arrow will correct that bad arrow flight and compensate for it, which is why you can still shoot amazing groups with a bow that is not even well tuned with field points. So if we shoot our broadheads and they are flying either high or low of our field points, we will want to fix this first. If your broadheads are hitting high above your field points, always double check your cam sync first and then either lower your rest or raise your knocking point slightly. If your broadheads are impacting lower than your field points and your cams are in sync, raise your rest or slightly lower your knocking point. Now for horizontal adjustments, the direction that you make your adjustments can sometimes be confusing or misleading based on where your center shot is currently positioned and the type of arrow rest that you're using, but let me explain. If your broadheads impact left of your field points, generally speaking, we would make a very slight rest adjustment to the left, or we would shim our cams to the right. Now we would only shim our cams if we had not done the paper tuning or bare shaft tuning process prior to this. As we make this adjustment, it's important to assess the arrows and determine if the broadhead arrow is getting closer to your field point arrow as you make the adjustments. Now, if you continue moving that rest to the left and you keep getting your broadheads impacting left no matter how far you move it left or how far you move it right, this is a good indication that your arrows are way too stiff for your current setup that you're shooting. Now, if your broadheads are impacting to the right of your field point arrows, either move your rest slightly to the right or shim your cams slightly to the left. Now, only move your rest if you did the paper tuning or bare shaft tuning portion before broadhead tuning, as the rest adjustment should be all that you need. Now, if you're making those adjustments, those rest adjustments to the right, and you keep not seeing a difference, if they're always spaced out the same distance apart from one another, typically this means that your arrows are a little bit too weak for your setup. So try turning your bow down by about 5 pounds or so and shoot and see if the problem persists. You'll likely find that it will clear up the issue. So if you want to shoot that heavier poundage, you're going to need to shoot a stiffer shaft or cut down your shaft or put less weight in the front of your arrow. Now sometimes when we make these arrow rest adjustments, we either get worse results or seemingly no change, and this is typically due to the dynamic arrow spine being way off or the center shot of your arrow rest already being too far out of tune from center. Now an example of this could be if you're a right-handed shooter and your broadheads are impacting right and your rest is already moved inside of your center shot close to your riser. If we continue to make rest adjustments to the right, we're seemingly going to get worse results or potentially no change to the results. So if this is you, move your rest back to center shot, restart the process, and assess the results from there. If you're still getting broadheads right and you did not paper shaft or paper tune or bare shaft tune, I recommend doing that. If you did not, you are likely going to have to shim your cams to the left. Now as you go through this process and make the adjustments, you will adjust your sight so that your pin hits on with your field points and with your broadheads at 20 yards and then 30 yards and 40 yards and however far it is that you decide to shoot. Note that on extreme distances, fixed blade broadheads will begin to impact lower than your field points, and this is not always due to tune. It is typically due to drag from the field points itself, or from the broadheads itself. Just like a 4-fletch arrow is going to have more drag than a 3-fletch arrow and impact lower at 100 yards, the same can be said about having a big fixed blade broadhead on the front of your arrow. It will induce more drag and impact lower when you get out to these extreme distances. Not that I am advocating in any way for anybody to take these far shots, but I just want to explain it so that you fully understand. This brings me to my next point, and that is not all broadheads are the same. Simply put, a big fixed blade broadhead will just simply not fly as accurate as a smaller diameter head or a mechanical. This is one of the reasons why mechanicals are so popular, because they are so forgiving in flight, but that does not mean that you shouldn't tune your bow. It is still a necessity, and it doesn't mean that mechanicals are the end-all be-all or better for you based on your setup. As a bow hunter, you've always heard that shot location is key. And it is, and the hidden advantage to using a mechanical broadhead is the fact that they are so much more accurate and so much more forgiving in flight. Now, this is not a push for mechanical broadheads, as not everyone's setup has enough kinetic energy, for my opinion, for them to use a mechanical broadhead in the first place. But if your setup has enough energy to use them, it is likely in your advantage to do so. I won't touch on this more here, as we have a whole nother video on real world broadhead testing linked in the description of this video. If you've watched the video to this point and you've gone through all of the steps in the video but you're still having problems, it's likely one of these issues that's causing it. Now, it's our job as bow hunters to be as proficient as possible so that we can make the most humane and ethical kill possible when we're out bow hunting in the woods. The first most common issue is hand torque. Now, this will give you broadhead flight inconsistency issues. This is the #1 cause of irregular broadhead flight, when your broadheads are impacting left, right, high left, low right on an inconsistent basis. It almost always leads back to the grip, where your hand is placed in the grip, how your skin is pulled, where you're setting it, where your pressures are. All of that make a huge difference with how that arrow is coming out of your bow and ultimately where those broadheads land. I'm not going to go into detail of how to grip your bow. We've got other videos on that, but make sure you've verified your grip is perfect so that you're not running into issues with hand torque. Probably the second most common, but not quite as common as hand torque, that could be giving you inconsistency issues is actually string pressure against your face. Now, this really doesn't cause issues unless you're shooting a very high let-off and you have a lot of string pressure on your face, where that string is burying into your cheek, your fletching, you're pushed up against your skin, and that string is pulled into your cheek really hard or on the side of your nose. If it's just lightly on the tip or lightly on the side of your face, you're not going to have issues from this at all. But if you are getting super facial contact on the string, it's definitely going to throw the back of that arrow off and cause inconsistent arrow flight when shooting broadheads. The third one, if you're not torquing your bow with your grip with your hand, and if you're not getting string facial pressure, it could be that you're shooting too weak of an arrow. When I say too weak, that arrow is flexing too much. Your bow is pushing too much energy into the arrow for what the arrow can handle. And when that arrow is flexing too much, it causes those big fixed blade broadheads specifically to veer to one side, catch that air going as it's flying, and veer to that direction. And typically with a weak arrow, with a right-handed shooter, that shaft is going to impact to the right. So if you're consistently getting right impacts, and no matter what you do, you adjust the rest, you adjust the shims, and you're still getting right impacts, it's likely your arrow is a little bit weak. But weak shafts can also cause inconsistencies. I've noticed where weak shafts can sometimes send arrows to the right, but also low, also high, and kind of give you mixed results as well. The fourth issue, this cannot be overlooked. This is so simple. We covered it first thing. It's cam sync. If you have any vertical broadhead flight issues, either impacting higher or lower, you've got to make sure your cams are in sync, where the stops are coming around and hitting the cables at exactly the same time. An 1/8 inch off or a 1/4 inch off is not good enough. It has got to be perfect. You've got to make these adjustments with the bow press. If you don't have a press, or if you don't have a draw board, you've got to go to a shop or somebody that does so you can get this corrected, because this will affect your vertical broadhead flight. If you're having those issues, you definitely need to double check this. The last thing I want you to double check is your fletchings. If you're shooting a big fixed blade broadhead, but you've got tiny little fletchings to steer that arrow, you've got more steering in the front of your shaft, which that broadhead is going to veer and lead that arrow off in whatever direction it goes to the easiest. That is going to give you inconsistencies with your shooting, so make sure you do have enough fletchings on the back of your arrows. Normally I don't see this as an issue. I usually see people have way too much fletching or way too much helical on the back of their arrow, but sometimes it's better to be a little bit more than not enough. Now, one final tip of what I personally like to do is I like to keep a couple bear shafts in my quiver just to shoot to double check to make sure they are flying on with my fletch shafts. I do this because I don't always want to shoot broadheads into target, tearing up my targets, but a bear shaft arrow will give you the same results and the same reaction that a broadhead tipped arrow will. If the bear shafts are going right, your broadheads are likely to impact to the right. Vice versa for all the directions. So I do always recommend keeping some bear shafts on you just to double check your tune, especially if you're on a trip, really hard on your equipment, or worried about something that might have moved. If you want to learn more about bow setup and tuning in general so you can learn how to do it yourself, check out our Ultimate Bow Build Masterclass linked in the description below. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, please comment, please let us know. If you have any questions about broadhead tuning whatsoever, please comment them below. We're always happy to help. And again, we always appreciate you guys watching. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one.